So let's dive in. And how should we start? Well, in the end, our goal will be to convert all class-based components into functional components. So let's simply dive into our different components. Now, the index.js file sets up the root of our application, and in there we have no class-based component, so we got nothing to do there. In app.js, that already changes. Here, our app component uses the class keyword and extends component. So that is already the first place where I want to convert it to a functional component. So I'll name it app, and this will be a function which receives props and then, well, has this function body. Now in this function body, we'll not have a render method, so we should get rid of that. And therefore, we also need to get rid of one closing bracket here, one closing curly brace. And in the end, we still want to return JSX because every functional component has to return JSX. Now, component did mount will not exist anymore, and you learned what can be used instead of component did mount. Do you remember? It's the use effect hook. So let's actually import use effect from React. And then here, instead of component did mount, we can use useEffect, and we have to pass a function to useEffect, which will execute whenever this component re-renders. So let's now move this props on try auto sign up into our useEffect function. But of course, we're not using this props anymore, but just props, because we're getting props as an argument here. I also want to make sure that this effect does not run every time this app component is re-rendered. It should only run on the first render cycle. And do you remember how you can control that with useEffect? Well, you can pass a second argument to useEffect, and that is an array of all the values, all the objects React should watch for, and only when these things, these arguments, these elements you have in this array change, this function in useEffect should run again. And if you pass an empty array, it essentially means this will only run once when the component is mounted, essentially. And that is exactly what I want here, and therefore I pass this empty array. Then we set up our routes, and there's nothing wrong with that. Here, where I access this props is authenticated. It should just be props. And we're done. Now, map state to props and map dispatch to props, this can still be used. There's nothing wrong with that. The only thing we need to change here is the name here, because I renamed my component to app. So the constant where I store this function is named app with a lowercase a, and therefore we have to use a lowercase a down there as well. And that is all. So we can still connect Redux to our functional component here. Nothing wrong with that. If we now save that, it reloads and it works as before, which already proves that this seems to succeed here. Now, if I do log in here with a valid user, this works. And if I now reload, auto login also works, which proves that this effect here is doing its job. So the first component has been converted. Let's move on.